we go. All right, so we are live. My name is Christy Walkuski. I'm the director of the Brain Center for Community Engagement. Julie Robinson will be logging in with us shortly here. This is our third session for our fall series, and you can find recordings of all of our previous fall sessions as well as our summer series at the event page, which is bw.edu/civic. Along with those recordings, you'll find a number of resources recommended by each of our presenters. It's really an astounding list of resources that have been compiled over the last few months. So for those of you, I know many of your names are familiar, but for anyone who this might be your very first Civic LEAD series, this series was created over the summer in the wake of a disturbing summer of violence and police brutality, which, of course, as we know, has sparked renewed momentum for the ongoing movement for racial justice. Here at BW, I know, we as a community have been coming to terms with our own shortcomings and areas for growth and improvement related to equity. So we truly appreciate each of you logging in and being with us tonight. We'll have everyone muted, but if you have any questions, Dr. Martin's going to address these towards the end of the presentation, so you can put them in the chat box to let us know you've got a question or a comment you'd like to share. And of course, this session is being recorded, so you can always revisit it at the event page. And just a final reminder that this event is rooted in the expectations established in BW's community standards of conduct. So we expect this to be a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. For today's session, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Terry Martin. I have to share personally, I was an English major here at BW, so I took several classes with Dr. Martin. I will not share how long ago that was, don't worry. But I'm thrilled to have you here sharing your expertise and your perspectives on this very important topic. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Martin.
Thank you very much, Christy, and Julie too. And let me thank all of you who are in attendance. No institution in our society, including Baldwin Wallace, is free of racism. But I am proud to be part of an institution that is taking active steps to confront it and to promote social justice. And let me also say that I approach the topic of African American literature with a deep sense of humility. I don't presume to be an expert on it. The last time I taught it was in the 1990s, but there wasn't enough student interest at the time to sustain it. Of course, I continue to teach some African American literary works in other courses, such as the Survey of American Literature. And I'm old enough to recall when the discipline of English consisted almost exclusively of works by dead white males, which itself was the product of structural racism and sexism and homophobia and so on. So I celebrate the opening of the literary canon and the inclusion of voices of diversity that now grace our literary tradition. And I take it as a hopeful sign that there has been a resurgence of interest nationally in reading African American literature in response to those recent and widely publicized acts of police brutality, as well as the overwhelming evidence of ongoing structural racism in our society, which I think can only be denied by someone blinded by white privilege. I myself have chosen to teach African American literature because it speaks powerfully to me. It remains a testament to the extraordinary strength, courage, resilience, artistic ability, and deep humanity of African Americans. For me, it has been a window into another world that my own comparatively comfortable suburban upbringing rarely brought me into contact with. I grew up in the 1960s in what was a largely segregated neighborhood in Rochester, New York. My parents supported the civil rights movement, and we decried the brutality of Jim Crow in the South that we observed on the nightly news. But I was much less aware of the racism in my own hometown and in my own backyard, so to speak. There were no African Americans on my street and only a few in my school. And so it was largely through books that I came to have a sense of what it was like to live on the other side of the tracks. Now, I no doubt have my prejudices like any reader, but my contention is that the reading and study of African American lit have helped me to become more aware of them, as well as of the nature of white privilege, which otherwise I think often remains largely invisible to whites. Excuse me. For instance, I first read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in high school, which was an eye-opener, to say the least. I was horrified, I was mesmerized, and I was deeply moved. And just as feminism has helped to liberate men from constricting gender roles, so African American lit can help to liberate the people who want to believe they are white. If we are truly to address racism in the United States, we must begin by acknowledging its historical impact on those who have borne the brunt of it. So I think that reading African American lit is one of the best means of doing so. And after all, unless we truly feel injustice in our hearts, we won't be moved to make the kinds of sweeping changes that our country, indeed our planet, needs. So I just clicked on to the next slide, but nothing's happening here. Let's see. How about, oh, wait a minute. Okay. I don't know why it happened that way. So let's see if it did. Very strange. Well, okay, I'll try. It's tricky, but anyway. Can you all see this or, yeah, great. All right, so in the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argues that the best hope for the end of mass incarceration and the creation of a truly just society lies in cultivating an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders. We must join hands with people of all colors. You know, and I think Black Lives Matter is not a movement exclusively for Blacks, nor are they claiming that only Black lives matter. I hold with Martin Luther King, who said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we all have, or ought to have, an obligation to confront racism, and it's going to require many people working together to do so. This is tricky to advance for some reason. There we go. So African American Lit offers one of the most effective means by which white Americans can understand what it is like to be Black or brown in a racist society. And reading literature has indeed been shown to increase empathy, especially when readers are emotionally transported by the story. Although white privilege normally serves to blind whites to the worst effects of racism, experiencing it vicariously in a book can be enlightening. If we identify strongly enough with a character, we can respond to virtual scenarios as powerfully as if we experienced them ourselves. Brain scans reveal that while reading, people simulate what others think and feel. People who read novels can become more adept at reading others' emotions. And I just, by the way, cited one sample study there at the bottom of the page. There are others that... Now, reading fiction offers three main advantages over news stories, for instance. Readers are granted access to a character's interior world in ways that journalism does not provide. So we can experience a character's thoughts and feelings as if they were our own. Readers of literature are more willing to suspend disbelief and thus not question the veracity of accounts involving the experience of racism. And novels in particular enable us to view a character's life developing over many years, which it is normally difficult to do. Thus, we are able to perceive patterns emerging over time and to trace the lifelong consequences of racism, such as why, for instance, African-American men and women have a life expectancy that is almost 5 years lower than that of their respective white counterparts. It's important to realize that African-American literature was born in the crucible of racism. And according to Henry Louis Gates, one of the leading African-American literary critics, African-American literature was written primarily for a white audience and, quote, generated as a response to allegations that its authors did not and could not create literature considered the signal measure of a race's innate humanity. Learning the master's tongue has been an act of empowerment, end quote. And indeed, Africans were widely viewed by both white Americans and Europeans as subhuman and incapable of rational discursive thought. For example, the publication of a book of poetry in 1773 by the first African-American poet, Phillis Wheatley, met with such incredulity that she had to submit to the equivalent of a doctoral examination by leading white men of Boston in order to prove that she was indeed the author of her own poems. Slave narratives. Now, they formed the beginnings of the African-American prose tradition, as well as the basis of many modern fictional works. And it's ought to be noted that the struggle of Blacks to achieve their own fiction was in many respects similar to American writers' own attempt to break free from European traditions. It's hard to believe, but in the early 19th century, Americans actually had an inferiority complex. And the slave narratives, some literary critics have argued, are really the first quintessentially American art form. Now, slavery has existed as an institution in many societies throughout history, but it took a particularly egregious form in America because of the dual impact of racism and of capitalism and the commodification of labor. Southern slave owners, could simply buy new slaves to replace the ones that they worked to death. And life was especially vicious under American slavery. Slave narratives provided firsthand testimony of the atrocities of slavery to a largely white, potentially hostile and/or incredulous audience. The genre of autobiography was chosen to augment the veracity of the account and to shield the writer from the charge of fictionalization, sensationalism, and exaggeration. Since slaves could not legally testify against their white masters, they could at best appeal to the court of public opinion. Moreover, abolitionists had to counter the propaganda of Southern plantation owners who argued that Southern slaves were actually much better off than their northern counterparts, industrial workers, since the Southern masters at least knew and cared for their slaves personally. Many white readers doubted that conditions were all that bad for slaves. Many visitors to Southern plantations even sometimes heard slaves singing in the fields and assumed that they were contented. Frederick Douglass had to disabuse his audience of that assumption by saying, and I quote, "Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart, and he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness." Slave narratives typically employed a direct, often objective style, including understatement, passive voice, and at times a pseudoscientific detachment. I quote a line I remember from Frederick Douglass's narrative: "The facts in the case are these," right? Because they wanted to document as objectively as they could what kinds of abuses were going on. And slave narratives introduce readers to the almost unimaginable horrors of slavery through an aesthetic framework that both distances and protects us. So the reader is granted a glimpse of hell without actually having to experience it directly. There are many exemplary slave narratives. I've simply mentioned about 8 here. Many were edited, of the hundreds that were published, many were edited and or ghostwritten by Northern whites. But literary scholarship has established the sole and exclusive authorship of many of the most famous slave narratives, including those by Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, Harriet Jacobs, and Booker T. Washington. So you can't go wrong reading any of these. They were very impactful narratives. And they in turn gave rise to what Ishmael Reed dubbed the neo-slave narrative, which were later fictional novelistic accounts of slavery. And see, these are some, again, there are many titles in this tradition as well. I simply list a number of the ones that I know personally are really great works. A number of these have won the Pulitzer Prize, such as Toni Morrison's Beloved and Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. So if you're looking for summer reading, this is another list you can't go wrong. Instead of giving you trying to cover the vast terrain of African American lit, which would be kind of absurd, I've instead decided to focus on a few works that have had a great impact on me. Because I think ultimately that's where the value lies. I mean, many of the works I've read have had an impact, but I'm just choosing a few representative ones, starting with two slave narratives. And in this case, Frederick Douglass's narrative, which I think is a paradigmatic one. After all, it embodies the heroic quest for freedom. You know, Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." But in fact, every fugitive slave had to put that into practice, you know, because running could subject you to death or torture, you know, or just horrendous punishment. It embodies self-reliance, and Frederick Douglass stood up to his master, and he stood up to a mob of angry white dock workers who attacked him all at once. You know, he's remarkable. The value of literacy, and Douglass says that he learned the value of literacy because his master was so determined that he not learn how to read. So he says, and I quote, "I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress." He was also clever in getting local white boys to help him learn the letters. Spiritual awakening. This is a time, of course, you know, in the 18th century, the time that it's called the Great Awakening. But Douglass does his own spin on this, and he substitutes knowledge of freedom for knowledge of God. So he says, and I quote, "From this time I understood the words abolition and abolitionist, and always drew near when that word was spoken. The light broke in upon me by degrees." And finally, solidarity with the oppressed. I mean, this isn't a comprehensive list, but they are some of the, I think, most important traits. Of his fellow slaves, Douglass wrote, and I quote, "They were noble souls. They not only possessed loving hearts, but brave ones. We were linked and interlinked with each other. I loved them with a love stronger than anything I have experienced since. I believe we would have died for each other. We never undertook to do anything of any importance without a mutual consultation. We never moved separately. We were one, made so in part by the mutual hardships to which we were necessarily subjected by our condition as slaves." So I know, you know, white Anglo culture, you know, is highly individualistic. This gives us a very different view and of an intense sense of, you know, communal identity and orientation. And of course, Douglass continued to work, you know, for the good of African Americans throughout his life. I think that Douglass's work is also paradigmatic in that it radically redefines the nature of emancipation. And it becomes liberation becomes a dialectical movement of spirit in which he first undergoes an almost complete negation of his own humanity. For instance, after 6 months of unrelenting hard labor to Mr. Covey, move something here. No, that's not really good. Trying to see the whole screen here, but all right. Mr. Covey was a man with a reputation for raking slaves. Douglass acknowledges feeling, quote, "broken in body, soul, and spirit. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute." This is his low point, his meter. But, I skipped ahead, sorry. Somehow I went to the next slide. All right, here we are. This is the epistemology of spirit, right? This is emancipation as transcendental affirmation. And I know, by the way, that you're not supposed to put a lot of text on the PowerPoint slides, but English professors can be granted a certain poetic license. And this passage is arguably the most important one, I think, in the entire book. So, see if I can read it on the screen rather than the one next to me, but all right. In response to his master's attempt to give him a beating, Douglass observes, quote, "From whence came the spirit, I don't know, but I resolved to fight. And suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. I told him that, come what might, he had used me like a brute for 6 months and that I was determined to be used so no longer. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, And I not only resolved that however long I might, sorry, I now, wait a minute. So I can't see it, the word on my screen. I now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. This passage is remarkable in affirming that emancipation is not ultimately dependent on social, economic, or political factors. Instead, the slave is made free through a transcendental act of will, which is the determination to refuse to be a slave. Once that spiritual revolution is achieved, then everything else will follow. Although Douglass legally remained a slave, he came to regard it as a mere form, which he would eventually slough off like a snake does its skin. Of course, not all slaves were as courageous or as successful, for it required putting one's life on the line. Douglass indeed remained committed to the abolitionist cause, which sought the legal emancipation of all slaves. But he nevertheless suggests in this passage that the most crucial struggle of all is the one that takes place inside. Slavery harms both masters and slaves, but in different ways. And the narrative documents the power of slavery to destroy slaves' bodies and to crush their spirits through such horrific abuses as starvation, hard labor, beating, maiming, rape, and murder. Yet, Douglass claims that slavery is equally injurious to masters who are corrupted by, quote, the fatal poison of irresponsible power, end quote, and therefore become cold, callous, and cruel. Interestingly, Douglass found religious slave owners to be the worst of all. When his master got religion, Douglass hoped that he would actually become more compassionate and merciful, but the opposite occurred. It was as if his master felt greater justification, greater sanction for his cruelty. Now, I often ask my students, after reading Frederick Douglass or any of the other slave narratives, which would you rather be? Right? A slave's life is hell. No one wants to be a slave, right? But the master typically pays a monstrous moral price. And I mean, ideally, we shouldn't have to make this choice at all. But if you had to be, thrust back into that world, it's a very wrenching kind of choice, because each side, pays such a huge price in different ways. Finally, Douglass sought to end slavery by any means necessary, but he took the broad-minded, forgiving view that both masters and slaves were, in their own way, victims of society. And just as we've looked at the paradigmatic male slave narrative, I'd like to talk a little bit about the paradigmatic female slave narrative, which is actually the first one published by an ex-female slave, Harriet Jacobs. And she said, slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Slave women could not legally refuse a master's unwanted sexual advances, which is one reason why there are so many light-skinned African Americans today. Indeed, slave women were often openly exploited as breeders to increase their master's stock, and their children could be taken from them and sold at any moment. Now, Harriet Jacobs originally asked Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, to write her autobiography for her. But Stowe was only willing to do so as part of a larger work that she planned to entitle Notes to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so Jacobs chose to write it herself. She wrote at night and kept it secret, fearing that her northern employer, Nathaniel Parker Willis, was pro-slavery. And I'm glad she wrote it because although she documents the emotional and psychological trauma of being a slave woman, she refuses to remain a victim. And she revises the conventional script, right? From tragic mulatta to courageous, determined, and resourceful fugitive slave and trickster who outwits and escapes her master. The tragic mulatta, by the way, was conventionally a lighter-skinned, attractive African-American woman with a pure heart and polished manners who falls for a white lover, but who cannot legally marry him because of the single drop of African blood in her veins and whose life therefore ends in misery in the fiction, in the sentimental fiction. However, Jacobs escaped in what was a truly epic feat, for she chose to remain in a narrow garret over her grandmother's house for 7 long years before she could be ferreted out. 7 years. Intense heat of summer, intense cold of winter, intense back pain. It's amazing. Jacobs also challenges the cult of domesticity, which was an ideal of femininity that was widespread among middle to upper class whites from 1820 to 1860. And it held that, that true women, right, should be pious, pure, submissive to their husbands, and domestic, keeping out of politics and public life and fulfilling their sacred destiny in the home. As a seduction narrative, Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl both relies on and resists the conventions of sentimental fiction of the era, most of which was written by middle and upper class white women. She made use of the genre's capacity to elicit sympathy for less fortunate characters and to shine light on social issues. Of course, the great example of that is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which uses sentimentality, right, to focus attention on slavery in an almost unprecedented way. However, Jacobs' narrative radically questions assumptions about gender identity posed by sentimental fiction. So let's look at those four traits. Piety, right? Jacobs questions God's justice in permitting slavery, as well as her grandmother's naive faith that God, quote, had seen fit to place Jacobs and her brother under such circumstances, and though it seemed hard, they ought to pray for contentment. Jacobs had to reject such a view as pernicious and misguided, and she decided that God's plan instead ought to be to help her to escape the South. Submissiveness, right? A slave girl can only be corrupted by submitting to the rapist slave master, while submissiveness in his wife merely aids and abets the crime. Purity. Jacobs aspired to purity, but the imminent threat of being raped by her master led her instead to assert her own sexual autonomy by sleeping with another white man. She observed, "There is something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you, except that which he gains by kindness and attachment." And apropos of that, she contextualizes purity into a relative rather than an absolute virtue, and suggests that under the circumstances, saving her virginity only for her master to steal it would have been unthinkably perverse. She knew that her master was building a cabin in the woods where he planned to install her for his own sexual pleasure. She also knew that he had made a practice of sleeping with other female slaves and then selling them down the river after they gave birth. And so she sought to exercise her sexual freedom preemptively, as it were. And finally, domestic. Jacobs herself strove for the domestic bliss of a hearthstone of her own, however humble. But she acknowledges that her story does not end in the usual way with marriage, but with freedom. And slave women had virtually no security in their home life. Most poor women didn't either. And women's confinement to the domestic sphere restricted their capacity for social activism, as well as access to jobs. So she's really kind of at odds with the major values for womanliness, right, of her era. Now, this leads to a deep ambivalence within her text, which I find fascinating. And it's as if, she has to express contrition and repentance because she is the classic fallen woman of seduction fiction, right? And so she will try to placate her white readers by saying that, yes, she's had sexual relations out of wedlock, and she appeals to their mercy and compassion. Quote, "I wanted to keep myself pure, but made a plunge into the abyss. Pity me and pardon me, O virtuous reader." But almost in the same page, she oscillates into open defiance and self-vindication. And she says, "I knew what I did, and I did it with deliberate calculation." But slave girls ought not to be judged by the same standard as others, for the condition of a slave confuses all principles of morality, and in fact renders the practice of them impossible. You know, it took immense courage for Jacobs to tell her story in public, a story that would virtually expose her to condemnation, right, in the eyes of many readers. And yet that was the only way that she could really make readers understand how horrendous slavery was. But in the process, as she's writing this book, she's also reminding readers of their white privilege. So it's a major kind of statement, you know, a major critique of the power structure, you know, of white privilege of the era. So we move from her to another novel that, well, a novelist and a novel that I love. The Art of the Bodacious here. You know, as the self-styled queen of the Harlem Renaissance, Hurston introduces a new, spunky, self-affirming style to African-American literature, which is beautifully embodied in her masterpiece, Their Eyes Are Watching God, 1937. So we're in the 20th century now, and Hurston, although she's no stranger to racism either in the South or the North, right, she will break with tradition, declaring that she was, quote, not tragically colored, and affirming a revolutionary ethos of self-love and acceptance. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. A delightful statement of hers. And despite the pervasive prejudice that that viewed African-American culture as inferior, and blacks in the South is especially backward, Hurston, who was born and raised in the South, loved her people, and she devoted much of her life to documenting and celebrating Southern Black folkways through the non-judgmental, compassionating gaze of the cultural anthropologist. She was the first Black graduate of Barnard College, and she studied cultural anthropology under the great Franz Boas, who is widely regarded as the father of American anthropology. He encouraged her to travel throughout the South, gathering African-American folktales and filming their dances and games, etc. In fact, Hurston embraced a Black is beautiful, even Black culture is beautiful ethos long before, you know, the first became a revolutionary slogan of the civil rights movement. So that's remarkable. And she rejects essentialist views of racial identity, emphasizing instead the social construction of race, observing, quote, I remember the very day that I became colored. It was one of the first times that she was in the company of whites, and they called her attention to it. She said, at certain times, I have no race. I am me. The cosmic Zora emerges. So she challenges the idea that race has inherent, properties, that it's a biological essence, and to that extent, modern biology bears her out. There is really no validity to the concept of race as it was historically developed. So 3 cheers for Zora for realizing that so much earlier. Their Eyes Are Watching God is a phenomenal novel, and it's really one of ecstatic revelation on many levels. I mean, for one, the language she uses, African-American vernacular English, right, is revealed as a medium worthy of the highest art. Janie Crawford, the protagonist, speaks this beautiful dialect, and she herself, notes that African-American women are regarded as the mules of the world. But she herself comes to beam out with light and to be lit up like a transfiguration. Indeed, that kind of describes the progress of the narrative, Now, as an adolescent, and I do have to give a little bit of kind of plot summary, but I promise not to be a spoiler. At least I spoiled the end of the novel. But as an adolescent, Janie is granted a vision of blissful love and fulfillment when she spends 3 very symbolic days under a blossoming pear tree and, quote, saw her life like a great tree in leaf. It's this beautiful organic image of potentiality. But her nanny, her grandmother, who is an ex-slave, who is described as a blasted old, is it tree? Sorry, I can't make out the word. Tree or trunk here. It's behind the, the pictures on the side of the screen. Blasted old. 3, yes. Trapped in a hellish infinity of conscious pain. Nanny believes that Janie needs protection, and so marries her off to an older local man of property because she wants Janie to sit on high like a white woman and have a prop to lean on. Now, as an ex-slave, Nanny has had a traumatic life, and she clearly cannot let go of the past. But Janie feels called to live fully in the present. But Janie agrees to marry the man that her grandmother chooses for her as her first husband, Logan Killix. But she soon discovers that he's like some old skullhead in the graveyard, desecrating the pear tree. And his house is like a lonesome stump. And as his name suggests, Logan, he even threatens her with an axe as if he were going to cut her down like a tree. So when Joe Stark comes along and says, "A pretty doll baby like you is made to sit on the front porch," she goes off with him in search of a better life. Stark becomes the mayor of Eatonville. Eatonville is an all-black township, one of the few in the South. But he is obsessed with power, and he seeks to keep Janie on a pedestal away from the community. As his name suggests, Stark ultimately takes, quote, the bloom off of things. Right? And life with him for Janie is distant, cold, lonely, and painful, as if she were being battered against a rock. So when a witty, charming, fun-loving, guitar-toting, gambling, partying, down-to-earth younger man named Tea-Cake comes along, whom everyone in town warns Janie against, you just have to read the rest of the book to find out. Whoops. What we see in the novel is a kind of dialectics of self-actualization, right? And Janie rejects the bourgeois obsession with wealth, status, and respectability as ultimately stifling and unfulfilling. Ironically, it is only by going down in the muck, right, which is a fertile area near Lake Okeechobee, and sharing the simple joys and vibrant community life of migrant farm laborers that her spirit is truly fertilized. Then she can return home to gather the rich spiritual harvest. All you need is love and autonomy. And Janie's need for love is counterbalanced, though, by the threat posed by each of her relationships with men. Logan Killix wants to treat her like a mule and cut her down to size. Joe Stark wants to turn her into a possession. And even Tea-Cake, who most loves and honors Janie, constitutes a risk as well. Janie must learn to love in ways that don't sacrifice her autonomy and integrity. Love must be a catalyst rather than a stifling form of codependence. And what she concludes, is you got to go there to know there. Everybody's got to find out about living for themselves. And this statement of self-reliance, I don't think Emerson could have said it better. And indeed, it's a novel that not only re-envisions the possibilities for women of color, but inspires all readers to live fully and authentically, no matter what condition they may find themselves in. You can see why I love the novel. And now we're going to look at our last one here, which is Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. Not Invisible Man in the sense of H.G. Wells, like sci-fi invisibility, of course, but invisible because whites cannot see him. And early in the novel, he announces that he's searching for his own identity, but he remains nameless, figuratively blind, at least throughout much of the narrative, right? Invisible to whites who refuse to see him as a human being. He is, moreover, treated like a commodified object for others' use and amusement, like a mechanical man, a robot, an automaton, a cog in a machine, a walking zombie, an instrument, a minstrel performer, a circus clown, a raw material, a black buck, and a brute, among other things. He is, moreover, blindfolded, censored, heckled, exploited, brainwashed, knocked out, electrocuted, dispossessed, dehumanized, lobotomized, and sent on a mission whose futility and absurdity are revealed to him only in a dream. Quote, keep this N-boy running. Now, he initially believes that white is right, but white is revealed to be an optical illusion in the course of the novel in a brilliant way. The Invisible Man goes to work in a paint factory called Liberty Paint Factory, where he learns that the whitest paint, appropriately called optic white, is produced by having 10 drops of black ink mixed in with it. Symbolically representative, right, of the 10% of the population that was African American. The paint is destined to cover national monuments, and so the implication is clear. American culture and American history are being whitewashed. Right? And indeed, blacks often didn't appear, you know, they weren't allowed to appear on TV or other in magazines, you know, in many venues that whites looked at. And unfortunately, the Invisible Man himself seeks to whitewash himself. He is proud of being lighter skinned. He's called ginger colored, and he looks down on darker blacks. And there's been a vicious, you know, traditional hierarchy of you know, tone of color, even among African Americans. And he's ashamed of his heritage, which he repeatedly tries to slough off, right, at least initially. But he's not successful in getting rid of his heritage. It seems to come back to haunt him at every point. He will initially go to almost any length to gain the approval of white men, and he covets their power and privileges, but he cannot become white without denying himself and sacrificing something essential within his own humanity. And his deep ambivalence is especially revealed when he is forced to watch a naked blonde white woman during a kind of hazing ceremony, in which he wants to regard her as an object, the same way that the white men in the room do. Yet he, of course, he's also, as a young black man, he's not supposed to be looking at a white woman. So he's in a double bind, as it were. But he, on the one hand, identifies with the white men and wants their powers and privileges. On the other hand, he identifies deeply with the dancer as a fellow victim. And so when the white men start tossing her in the air, he says, quote, "Above her red, fixed smiling lips, I saw the terror and disgust in her eyes, almost like my own terror." In one of the first great works of post-colonialism, The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon noted the susceptibility of the colonized to become as oppressive as their former colonizers, even after the colonies were liberated. To his credit, the Invisible Man doesn't lose his capacity for compassion, even though he's trying to pattern himself, you know, on whites. And although he's initially ashamed of his ethnicity and heritage, he learns ultimately to embrace it, finding essential sustenance in jazz and the blues and in African-American folktales, among other rich cultural traditions. By the way, the novel itself is brilliantly structured on the incremental theme and variation structure of jazz, as well as on the motifs of folk tales. So in this sense, the novel performs its very subject matter. And although freeing himself of his illusions is a difficult and painful process, he is thereby able to achieve a truer and more authentic understanding of himself and his society. The novel affirms that we are all in this together and that our future depends on our removing our respective blindfolds, just as he has succeeded in removing his own. And just a final comment here. I mean, this novel is a great masterpiece that rewards reading and rereading. It gets richer every time, like most great literature. For me, the novel reveals that whiteness is an inauthentic basis for identity, for it creates a false sense of superiority in those who want to be white and a false sense of inferiority in the oppressed. Moreover, the novel suggests that Black America has always been white America's Jungian shadow. That is to say, whites have simply projected their own unacknowledged desires and traits onto Blacks and then stigmatized this visible shadow. Just as in the novel, a white millionaire becomes obsessed by hearing the story of True Blood, a poor Black farmer who has, strangely, in his sleep, committed incest with his daughter. And we learn that the white millionaire himself harbors incestuous feelings towards his own daughter, but he has not been able to acknowledge them as such. But instead, you know, he kind of projects them onto this poor Black farmer. And the Invisible Man concludes the novel by saying, "Who knows, but that on the lower frequencies, I speak for you." He does indeed, in my view, and he shows me just why and how my own liberation is bound up with his. And I'd like to thank you for listening and open the floor to questions.
Hi, I have a question.
Great.
So you were talking about, I guess when you were talking about the like potential mental toll of I guess enslavers on like I guess ignoring humanity in order to enslave other people. I don't know, I guess I was kind of confused when you made the comparison of being like a master to being a slave, because I feel like while there could be a mental toll, it's still, I guess, very different scenarios.
Right. No, I did not mean to imply that the masters suffer in the way that slaves do. What I meant is that what happens to them, their integrity is sacrificed. They become so callous and so cold and so cruel. I asked my students if they would want, if they were given the choice, if they would want to allow that to happen to themselves. But you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to imply that the masters suffer in any way, kind of like the slaves. I think often their suffering is, it's of a very different, kind altogether, because obviously they have all kinds of privilege that slaves don't. So thank you for raising that question, because I do need to clarify that.
Terry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll jump in. I'm really interested. You trace this wonderful trajectory across the 19th century and early 20th century. And I guess I'm interested in the African-American writers of the 21st century you find most interesting, and any ways in which sort of African-Americans writing now, the ways in which they are changing the conversation. So your favorite Black writers of the 21st century.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's where, by the way, I originally meant to go. I discovered I ran out of time. So I have recently read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and it is just the most powerful, visceral representation of what it's like to be African American today. I mean, it's just a hard-hitting, disturbing, deeply disturbing book, because you experience, through his eyes, what it's like to be continually exposed to violence from many different sources, right? And also that his son, is exposed to violence. His friends, his family are exposed to violence. This is something that, that African Americans live with in a way that for white Americans, it doesn't usually pop up. We're not, the subject of stop and frisk, examinations by police. I mean, we know that racial profiling, drives a lot of that. We know that the police tend to focus on the inner city. They don't go into wealthy neighborhoods. They don't go looking for drugs in the homes of the wealthy. But they will sometimes invade entire neighborhoods in the inner city and then just arrest people en masse. And there's a sense in which no one is exempt, no one is immune. There's no protection. Their lives are just on the margin, on the line continually. And so that work in particular, I would recommend. I'd love to hear other, suggestions from yourselves, but indeed, that's the one thing I regret, that my presentation only went up to mid 20th century. But Toni Morrison, she just, of course, recently passed, but, a Nobel Prize winning author. And you can pick any Morrison novel, but Beloved especially. By the way, the editors of modern library editions, came up with a list devised by white men of the best 100 novels in English, in the past. the past century, and there weren't many people of color on it. So another alternative list was proposed, by teachers and other interested critics, and Beloved was placed at the very top, of that list. Now, you can find other lists on the internet, and I haven't left you with one just because if you Google, best African-American lit, you'll come up with, dozens of lists, and plow into any one of those. But yes.
It's interesting because everything you said sounded as though you'll be able to trace the thematics from the 19th century all the way to the present. And it really speaks to how entrenched institutional racism is, that, some of the same themes that of violence against Black bodies that you see in slave narratives, are still sadly too relevant in Coates's own writings. So it's just really interesting, but obviously really deeply tragic. But thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And by the way, I think, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is the most profound and disturbing analysis of ongoing, structural racism in our society, and especially looking at our system of incarceration, which, although it's nominally called the war on drugs, that kind of drove on it really became a war on poor people of color. There were just enough whites, that they could claim that the system was colorblind. But if you look at the numbers, and she does an amazing and devastating analysis of the actual statistics, it's clear, who's getting sent there. More African Americans are being warehoused, like African American men are being warehoused in prisons than are going to college. And we have to ask ourselves, is this what we want in our society? Aren't there better, don't people deserve, the chances up to happiness? So I think, that book is essential reading, and novels too, because, that's where we get kind of more of the feeling, we get what it's like from a particular point of view, but hers provides just a stunning overview, of what's going on. And I tell you, it disturbed me really deeply. All these books disturb me. And that's one of the reasons I turn to them, because it's so easy to slip back into the comfortable state. That's what white privilege is, right? It's the option to ignore, right? Because it doesn't seem to affect you, right, as powerfully or as directly. We have, I could just kind of disappear into my my suburban home and close my eyes if I wish. But I also know that I pay a price, morally speaking, and that ultimately, everyone's happiness is bound up. Whatever happens to one group will in some way, come back to hurt, the oppressors. So yeah, it's definitely going on today. And by the way, any other suggestions from any of you of works that you've read recently that have impacted you? And tell me if we're running over time here, because I can also stay on afterward if anyone wants to speak there.
Terry, I don't know if you've read any of Ibrahim Kendi's works, but the one that I read of his is Stamped from the Beginning, which I thought was a really insightful look at the historical development of racism going back centuries, and looking at how people of color in particular were treated in different contexts, and in Europe, beginning in Europe, and how marginalization began there, and particularly in different religious contexts. And I found it really interesting to follow that through, and it explained a lot of things to me as to how this particular social hierarchy with people of color placed below whites got started, because it wasn't always that way.
Yeah. No, thank you for that recommendation. Yeah.
I just want to make an observation as well about just the power of literature. If anybody attended the EQLS event last year with Anthony Ray Hinton, you heard him share just the power that his experience in literature had while he was on death row. And we've heard through our continued work with the Equal Justice Initiative that some of the tactics used within prisons is to disallow prisoners from having access to books as a punishment or just a means of oppression. And so it's an interesting initiative that some of our students have been talking about, getting more literature, especially into the juvenile facilities. And I know there was an effort in Cleveland to start some writing programs, creative writing programs within some of the juvenile spaces. So if anybody's interested in any of that, please reach out to the Brain Center, because there has been some efforts to get things like that going. So, but thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is Julie, Christy's counterpart in the Brain Center. Thank you so much, Terry, for presenting today. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective, and I have a list of books I need to read here now. I just want to share that our final Civic LEAD presentation of this semester is coming up next week, and it's bound to be a good one. So Christy mentioned the Juvenile Justice Center or system, and Kiston Palmore, who works in community engagement and reentry with the Ohio Department of Youth Services, will talk about racial equity and the criminal legal system. So hope you can join us for that. I think that's all she wrote, unless others have things to add.
I can hang out just in case anyone wants to chat, but thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Have a great night.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely.